but it wasn't that often. Alas, I found myself at the end of an exhaustive cycle. I was definitely about to reach my limit. One night, during that red line period, I did my usual routine where I pulled into the hospital while waiting for a client. It was an unusually slow night, and I was expecting lots of passengers, so I didn't really know what to do. I held out that I'd make more money later on in that night, so went and got an energy drink from a vending machine in the lobby. It didn't matter. I plopped back down in the driver's seat, turned on my favorite playlist, and then passed out just right there. I wasn't asleep for very long, but it was a deep catatonic rest. You know the one? Mouth wide open, drooling, mouth breathing, looking my absolute worst. There is one thing that I dislike more, and that's the feeling of waking up when I shouldn't have been asleep. My brain starts to immediately overcompensate. I can't make any connections despite all the sparks. I can't remember where I am, who I am, what I'm doing. There are times when teachers would catch me sleeping in high school. I'd be so startled when they woke me up. I couldn't even speak proper English. Just make weird noises and get silent, then literally have to remember how to make it all make sense. It was one of those times. I remember kicking myself awake because my head was at this weird, funny angle. I made this kind of groaning sound as I snapped back into the waking world. It was still inside my car. It was still nighttime. Hell, it was the same playlist coming through the speakers. I peeked up at the clock and saw that I was only out for maybe 15 minutes. I took a deep breath through my nose and then settled into the seat. A cat nap was actually perfect, allegedly giving us more energy than a longer nap. I checked my phone and saw that I didn't miss anything, but there was a person that I could swoop up nearby and make a few bucks off. I took another swig of my drink, checked my mirrors, and then went to shift into park. I stopped though. There was something off in my rearview mirror. If I wasn't mistaken, there was a person sitting right behind me in the middle seat. We make eye contact. I whirled around and sure enough, plain as day, there's a man just sitting not 12 inches from me. He gets a little smile across his face and just kind of nods, like he was acknowledging that I'd been asleep. It almost looked like a little hello on his end. I really didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to start screaming at him to get out. Another part of me wanted to put on this front, act real tough, and then the other part of me just wanted to ask what he was doing inside my car. That's when I looked down and saw the Uber app open in his phone. I remember the sticker in my window that I was parked outside of a hospital. This guy probably exited my car. One of these buildings was wandering to a through street while he booked a ride. Then he just happened to see me for whatever reason. Seeing his phone helped my brain regain just a little coherence, and that put the panic to rest. So I simply said, "Hi, what are you doing in my car?" He didn't respond for a moment, just kind of looked at the floor and then the ceiling, anywhere but directly at me. I gestured to his phone and then continued to talk. "Are you looking for a ride or something?" I asked. He nodded. Okay, he's at least halfway normal. I got on at length for a bit, pulling my seatbelt on. Then I explained to him what I explained to you. I worked 2 jobs, I was tired, and I just happened to fall asleep. I said I'd be happy to give him a ride in exchange for a good review, one that wouldn't say that I was sleeping inside my car. We both shared a laugh on that one. "I'm trying to get downtown," he said. He pointed back Jackson Drive, a main drag through the area. "Where?" I asked. He then gave me these loose directions, but said it was pretty close to an old music venue that had shut down a few years before. I was familiar with that area, so I just started the route. We made a little small talk, mostly about myself and how I'd fallen asleep. This guy's name was Donovan. He said that when he got in the car, he went to speak, but saw that I was snoring, so just decided to wait. "Well, I appreciate you not being a weirdo," I said. "I was about to freak out before I saw your Uber app. Then it hits me. This guy and I aren't actually linked up. He never ordered a ride through the city, the app, and I haven't logged picking anyone up. I take a quick glance at him in the rear view and say, "Hey, I just realized this ride isn't registered. Can you find me on the app really quickly?" That's when the guy scoffs, looks out the window and says, "Oh, I'm not paying for this." I laugh, to which he just stays silent. It's getting a little awkward now. I glanced into the back real quick, realized the mistake that I've now made. This guy, it isn't dressed like a professional, no business casual, if you catch my drift. He's filthy, he's got torn up clothes, he's only got one shoe on, his face is dirty and dark from sun exposure, and there's this grimy backpack next to him. He's homeless, he has to be. While I was asleep, some drifter hanging around in the hospital must have just climbed into my car, thinking he'd be able to sleep in it or something. I noticed it on my second glance, though. Donovan is wearing a bracelet, the paper kind that they use in the hospital for discharge. This guy, probably odd behind a trash can, got Narcaned and is now getting a free ride back to his crack house. All because I couldn't keep my eyes open, shake my head, hit my blinker, and then start guiding my car towards the next exit. "Yo, where you going?" he asked from the back. "I told you where we're going. I'm not driving you across town for free, dude." "You're lucky I don't even call the cops," I countered. I took my phone out of the cup holder beside me, just to show him that I wasn't messing around. "Yeah," Donovan said. "You're lucky I don't unlace my shoe and strangle you with it." Before I could even blink, I felt his crusty, calloused hands sneak around the headrest and wrap around my throat. Instinctually, I took one hand off the wheel and tried to break his grip, but I couldn't do it. I barely got a finger underneath his palm to create just this little space to breathe. Panic started to set in. As I watched a minute tick by on the clock, I tried to get this guy off of me. I could hear his raspy breath just behind me. The smell coming off his hands and mouth was completely disgusting. This dude definitely hadn't showered in at least a week or more. Then it finally hits me. I had to get him off of me. I check my mirrors and see that I'm alone on this stretch of the highway. I then firmly slam on my brakes. I was belted in, but dipshit Donovan behind me wasn't as lucky. He slammed forward right into my seat, which created a little space in his arms. I yanked with my free hand, broke his grip, and then gunned the car over the shoulder. At this point, Donovan has recovered and is now trying to grab me again, but I'm not letting that happen twice. We're in a bit of a standoff now. I put the car in the park and put the hazards on. I say to hell with it, this has already gone too far. I dial 911, hit the call button, and press the phone to my ear. He starts to trip out, makes a lot more threats, but starts to get out of my car now. That's when I notice he's holding a purse, a pretty nice one at that. He grumbles a little bit, shoulders his backpack and that purse, then steps out into the cool night air. He then proceeds to start walking down the shoulder, down the exit ramp, and back into the city. I hear dispatch in my ear, and I realize I can't just let this asshole go. I start rattling off everything that just happened to me, where I'm at, and where the perp is located. As I'm describing the scene, the dispatcher gets quiet for a second, maybe even mutes me, then comes back with new information just a minute later. She says my report matches an earlier one from that exact hospital that I was parked at. Apparently, old Donovan had been admitted exactly as I figured, and during his stay, he became incoherent, agitated, and realized that he wasn't being supervised. He unhooked himself from the machine, put his clothes back on, then just exited the hospital, but not before stealing a purse out of one of the rooms in his wing. She noticed not long after it went missing and got with hospital security. They got on the cameras. I didn't take very long to see this guy strolling out the front door with that woman's purse in hand. From there, he starts running, as seen on the footage. He was probably paranoid about getting caught, now that he'd exited the hospital. He zigzagged through the parking lot for a bit before coming upon my car, which was on and idling. D-bag Donovan thought he was going to be able to steal my car up until he saw me sleeping in it. From there, he just snuck into the back and hid from any potential hospital security. Needless to say, Donovan's night went south after he got out of my car. I told dispatch where I was and where he was headed, and then even followed him down the exit ramp. I didn't make it 2 blocks before a cop swooped in, blasted him with the lights and siren, and threw him in a pair of cuffs. The phone that I'd seen in his hand was the woman's phone. He'd found it in her purse. He was trying to figure out how to order an Uber in the event that I didn't wake up. It just happened to be the perfect guise in the moment. I gave a statement to the officers who hauled him off. I suspected he spent a couple weeks drying out in a jail cell. I probably don't need to say this, but remember to lock your car doors, people. I'm a 46-year-old male, and while I wouldn't say I've had a life of danger and intrigue, I have worked a handful of unusual jobs. I've traveled a good bit and have some interesting life experiences. I've also inherited some strange traits from my father, which detracts weirdos, crazies, and the troublemakers. I don't know if it's my appearance or just some sort of aura, but if I'm in a crowd and there's a mentally unstable homeless person in the vicinity, you can damn well bet that they're going to approach me. When I tell people this, they often think that I'm kidding or exaggerating. But those who are around me long enough will eventually find out that it's all true. Over the years, I've amassed a collection of stories, most of them being humorous, strange, and just interesting tales. But I do have a few stories that are just downright scary. Today, I would like to share one of those with you. On a final note before I begin, I've included some details in this story that may seem unrelated to the incident itself. My reasoning for doing so is not only because I think the setting and context are significant, but also because I've got more stories from this awful period in my life. This will make a lot more sense once you hear the story. Now, let the fun begin. Back in the early 2000s, I was living in the city of Pittsburgh and worked as a credit manager for a rental company. A few years prior, I had foolishly dropped out of college and was living in an apartment that I couldn't really afford. Bills were starting to pile up. I needed to find a job with a decent wage. A friend contacted me and told me that he was leaving his job. The company would be looking for a replacement. When he first told me about the job, I naively thought the company rented out furniture and appliances to businesses just for events, and once they were finished renting the items, they would conveniently be returned. How hard could that be? Boy, was I in for a rude awakening. After I got hired, I found out that the company's business model was to rent to own, and they preyed on welfare recipients and people with low incomes. The cheap rental rates for furniture, TVs, stereos, and appliances were enticing to those who couldn't afford such things, but unbeknownst to the renters, the items would take years to pay off. These people would 10 times more than what the item was really worth. My job title was just a fancy name for a repo man. If someone couldn't pay or refused to pay, it was my job to hunt them down and repossess those items. Oddly, out of all the insane situations that I'd encountered while out repoing in the projects, this occurrence actually took place behind the store on my day off. It's important to note that generally, when you see a rent-to-own store, it's either or near a rough neighborhood. Usually, they're located conveniently near one of those payday loan stores or a token liquor store. The shopping plaza where we were located wasn't in that bad of an area, but it was closest to the shopping center to the nearby projects. I'd heard a rumor that the plaza's large parking lot was a hotbed for drug activity, and while it wasn't that uncommon to see multiple lit-up police cars in the lot, I never knew if it was just drug bust or maybe just crackhead shoplifting. Now, being this was my day off, work was the last place that I wanted to be, but the shitty van that I drove at the time was having engine troubles. So when my shift ended on the previous night, I left the van in the back of the store and then got a ride from a co-worker who lived nearby. The plan was to get a ride back to the store in the late morning, bring my tools and work on the van, and hopefully, get it back up and running. I remember that it was actually a beautiful summer day, which is pretty rare in Pittsburgh, so I was happy at least that I didn't have to work out in the rain. The back of the store looked like your typical loading dock area that you would see at any shopping plaza throughout the US. The plaza itself was fairly large and roughly 300 yards long. Across from the loading docking area was where all these stores kept their dumpsters. Beyond the dumpsters, there's overgrown weeds and bushes, then railroad tracks, and eventually a wooded area that ran along the Monongahela River. Our store was located smack dab in the middle of that shopping center. I ended up getting there a little later than I wanted to. My van was high enough that I didn't need to jack it up, so I threw down some cardboard and just got immediately to work. There were some preliminary things that I had to do before I got to whatever the real actual problem was, so I didn't really get things apart until by afternoon, and by then it was moving back and forth between the driver's seat and the space between the van. Hours ticked by, and soon the sun was starting to go down. I don't remember exactly how long I was under there or had been working, but I remembered that I was in the driver's seat trying to get the van started. At this point, I thought I had it pretty much pegged. I was pulling myself out from underneath the van, and I heard distant running footsteps. I stood up and saw this skinny dude about 75 yards away from me, running toward me. Aside from the immediate thinking that it was an odd place to be out for a jog, I didn't think much more of it. As he got closer to me, I nodded and said hi. But when he looked at me, it was the look of pure fear and panic. This man wasn't jogging, he was full on sprinting. He was younger than I initially thought. Maybe he was in his mid-20s, and he was casually dressed. But they definitely weren't clothes that you'd wear while jogging. Completely confused, I just stood there, watched him run toward the dumpsters, and then disappear. While it was odd, you usually don't see people in the back of the plaza. I was used to seeing weirdos and the occasional river people, or just homeless people who camped out near the riverbank. I shrugged it off and decided to get back to work. Around 30 seconds later, I hear footsteps once again. I see another man running toward me. As he approached, I could tell this man was bigger, and maybe in his late 30s. He had a beard and was wearing a hat. There's something about him that was a lot more intimidating though. I'm 6'2", and at the time, I weighed about 215 pounds. People often said that I looked intimidating, to which you kinda had to at the job that I was at. But it only took one look from this man to know that he wasn't somebody to fuck with. Once he was within about 10 yards from me, he yelled, "Where is he? Where'd he go?" Without hesitation, I quickly pointed towards the dumpsters. Looking back, I felt like a pushover, just doing what this stranger told me to do. But there was this assertiveness about this guy that just made me instantly comply. This is where shit starts to get crazy. Together with a bearded man walking just slightly behind me, I began to head over toward the dumpsters, which were maybe 25 yards away. Thinking by now that skinny guy was long gone, probably deep in the wooded area near the river, I was just going to point out in the general direction to where he ran. But as we approached the dumpsters, I noticed a crouching figure behind one of them, and all of a sudden I hear, "Get the fuck out here now." When I turned around, I saw that bearded man. He was now a few feet away from me, aiming a gun directly at skinny guy. Dumbfounded, I just stood there, frozen, as if I couldn't process what was all going on. Skinny guy stands up and hesitantly walks towards the bearded man, who grabs him and shouts to him immediately, "Get the fuck on the ground." He throws him onto the pavement. I was soon snapped out of my frozen state by the sound of screeching tires. At the opposite end of the plaza, maybe 150 yards away, I turned to see a pickup fishtailing around the bend, headed straight for him. For us at full speed. It was at this moment I realized I needed to get the hell out of this situation instead of just standing there with my mouth hanging open. I ran back toward my van and just hid behind it. I see the pickup truck slam on its brakes, just a few feet away from Skinny Guy on the ground. Two armed men get out of the truck. Another armed man jumps down from the back of the truck. All the men were yelling angrily, and every other word being fuck. I could hear one of them say to the Skinny Guy, "Oh, you fucked up, man. You fucked up." Two of the men grab Skinny Guy and yank him up off the ground. They drag him to the back of the pickup, and at gunpoint, one of them yells, "Get in the fucking truck." They made Skinny Guy lie down, face first, on the truck bed. At this point, you can no longer see him. Two of the men get inside the cab, while the other two, still with guns drawn, climb back into the truck bed. As they're about to leave, the two men in the truck bed hunched down and tried to look less conspicuous. While I could no longer see their guns, it was obvious by the way that their arms were extended. They still had their guns aimed at the Skinny Guy's head. They sped off and disappeared around that bend. For a split moment, I just stood there in disbelief, wondering what the hell I just witnessed. It all happened so fast. After the bearded man drew his gun, it seemed like from his perspective, I no longer even existed. Who the hell were those guys? They members of some criminal organization or drug dealers? Maybe they were even undercovers for the D. I thought of the possibilities that maybe they were even dirty cops. You'd think if they were law enforcement or D, they would have at least announced it and talked like cops, or maybe even used handcuffs. Yet if they were criminals, they sure seemed organized. Didn't seem to care about waving their guns around often. Either nor did they care about the fact that I was witnessing all of it. Shortly after I had these thoughts, and they'd ran through my head, I ran into the store to tell my coworkers what just happened. I honestly can't remember who was all there that day, but I distinctly remember two of my coworkers who were there. We'll call them Sarah and Mark to protect their identities. Sarah was the receptionist. Mark was the store manager. When I told them everything that just happened, they both said something to the effect of, "Damn, that's crazy." Yet it was like they couldn't comprehend the severity of what really happened. It wasn't like they completely shrugged it off, but they didn't seem to be as shocked as I was. It was absolutely wild to me, the difference in our reactions. They were just pretty much focused on closing down. I was out back, front line to the chaos. It was a perfect dichotomy. I thought maybe it was because everyone in this godforsaken place had become so numb to the insanity, used to hearing crazy stories from the so-called road dogs like myself. Honestly, they probably weren't all that surprised to hear the people behind the store were waving guns around. After seeing their underwhelmed reactions, I regained my composure and went back outside to finish working on my van. About a half an hour later, I saw two men slowly walking behind the dumpster area. The pavement ended and the weeds began. Occasionally, they would stop and look through the weeds and bushes, and eventually made their way onto the railroad tracks, still looking as if they were searching for something. They weren't there for very long, and after a few minutes of looking around, they just walked away and disappeared. After that, I never heard or saw from any of those guys ever again. To this day, I don't know why I didn't report any of this incident to the police. I guess a part of me suspected they were somehow involved. My theory was the armed men were undercover cops, either police or D. They had staged a drug deal and were running surveillance on one, and then they tried to arrest the Skinny Guy, or else maybe he grew suspicious, and that's why he fled the scene. After fleeing, the Skinny Guy stashed or tossed the drugs somewhere, hence the guy who were looking around afterwards. That seems to be the most plausible scenario, yet another part of me has some doubts about it all. Something about the whole thing was just off, and while it's not like the incident haunts my conscience on a daily basis or anything, sometimes I do get this guilty feeling, as if I ratted that Skinny Guy out and sent him to his death. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I'll never know. I ended up quitting that job almost a year later. I worked there for 3 years, And toward the end, I began to notice that I'd become very cynical, mean, and depressed. I also became a heavy drinker, among other things, and I knew I had to get out of that place and find a new path, which thankfully, eventually I did. Anyhow, I've tried to bury and forget most of these memories from that time in my life. But there were a few repo incidents that I can't forget, like the time I almost had to jump out of a second-story window, or the time I had to hide from a customer's psychotic husband. If there's anyone interested in these stories, leave a comment. Life is pretty busy these days, so it may take me, but I enjoy writing and have plenty to write about. Thanks for listening. Back when I was married, and way more appropriately aged for the job, I was a bartender in a pretty rural community. The place itself was called the Red Bear. It was kind of a local hangout for the old-timers, the day laborers, and really anyone without drama. We'd have live music on the weekends, a fish fry on Friday, all the little quaint, small-town stuff that we do to drum up the business. I was one of the few women that worked there. The Red Bear had been the place to be in our town for something like 40 years. My mom had been one of the AUG servers and bartenders back in the day, so it was kind of a cool experience for me, tracing the same steps, completing the same duties as my mom had done for a few decades prior. We didn't have any stake in the ownership or anything, but our history there made it feel special and super sentimental. I look forward to going to work pretty much every day. This place had a history though. Weird things happened because of it too, or at least I think so. And honestly, my first-hand experiences are pretty convincing. Because the place was a bar, some of us would be there well into the early hours in the morning. Are they cleaning up or finishing up some other closing duties? The building was very old, all brick and creaky lumber, had a lot of shadowy corners. The place was creepy, especially in the dark. If you were alone, it was extra unsettling. Even for me, the first time I'd heard about anything about the ghosts or whatever is in there. I heard it from my mom. I was just a little girl at the time, maybe 11 or 12. My mom would come home from work absolutely terrified, all pale, wide-eyed, and covered in sweat. It took some prodding, but eventually she told me some of the stories. This would set the stage for me, because by the time I got a job there, it was firmly established that the Red Bear was definitely haunted in my mind. There were really only rumors, nothing concrete about its history. Someone had been murdered there over a gambling dispute. A man caught his wife cheating with a regular, so showed up at the bar with a 12-gauge, murdered every patron in the building. A disgruntled woman who had worked in the kitchen allegedly poisoned much of the food one morning and sent multiple people to the hospital and a couple to the morgue. Again, all of these were rumors. There was very little evidence to support any of these stories. The only weird thing that might suggest one of them happened was the shotgun murder. At night, when the lights were low and a band was playing, you can see glistening things in the walls. We thought they were just glitter for a long time. But one year, when a wall repair was being made, the contractor told us it definitely wasn't glitter, but birdshot embedded in the wood. Sure enough, someone had discharged the shotgun in the main room at least a couple of times in its lifetime. Whatever the case, I found myself on one of those nights, alone and closing in the dark. The building was so old that you could hear the electricity humming in the wires if it was quiet enough. Eerie. It had a grand walk-up staircase that led to the front room. It and then spilled into the main dining room. To the left was a smaller dining room, and then the bar beyond that. Directly behind the main room was the kitchen, a dish pit area, and then some linen storage. There was a back door that led to a path that you could take to the dumpster as well. There was also a stairwell that went down into the basement. I want you to envision the dankest, creepiest hole in the ground imaginable. Fill it with shoddy woodwork, concrete, a few buzzing light bulbs, and a series of walk-in coolers and a walk-in freezer. We kept extra kegs of beer, dry storage, all kinds of random things down there. An employee could find themselves running into the basement 3, 4, maybe even 5 times in a busy shift. If you were one of the closers or had to do the ordering at all, you could spend a few hours down there just getting it organized. It was a Sunday. The place was a complete disaster. I had spent the first half of closing just trying to get it all cleaned up. I was not starting to do the restock just yet. This involved multiple trips to and from the basement, getting bulk napkins, ketchup, beer bottles, you name it. I was hauling it all up for the following day's service. Anyone who works in the service industry knows what I mean. Sunday evening is like breathing life back into a corpse, trying to keep it reanimated through another week. The business from Friday and Saturday just eats up any stock that you might have. Like I said, this place was a haunt to me by reputation, but as an employee, I didn't really think about it very often. Unless something weird was actually happening, it was never really in my mind. We weren't shaking the moment that we clocked in, or peeking into rooms before we entered them. It was a job, so we focused. I was on my 3rd or 4th trip up when I heard it. Footsteps in the kitchen. I was stocking the beer coolers in the bar, and there was a straight shot from my position, through the bathroom hallway and into the first portion of the kitchen. It sounded like someone's sneakers were sticking to the tile, and then descended the stairs into the basement. I looked up and listened, but then I remembered that I was alone. I shrugged and figured it was the ghost getting settled in for the night. There's really nothing to do about it, except for hurry up and just get the hell out of here. I had a system though. If shit got too weird before I finished, I would just leave and come back in the morning to get it all done. I don't mess around with the dead or whatever the hell haunts this place. As I put the last beer in the fridge, I can hear one of the walk-in coolers open. The pole handles are these big jingly metal things, so they're loud as hell when you yank on them. I stood still for a moment, but everything went quiet. Just as I started to break down the cardboard of the beer boxes, I hear that cooler slam shut downstairs, and it felt like it shook the whole building when it did. All right, it's go time. I start speeding through every little job that I have left. I didn't even bother counting my tips. Just tossed them in my purse and saved it for when I get home. Sinks are drained, things are closed and secure. I just need to lock the back door and hit the lights in the kitchen. At this point, 10 or 15 minutes had passed, and nothing more had really happened. The bar kind of reverted back to its normalcy, so I disarmed my paranoia that I had from earlier. I was still on edge, but I did my last walkthrough, found a few things that needed to organize or fill in the back. I made the mistake of putting my purse down, as well as the bank bag and the keys for the door. All of a sudden, I was back in work mode, and soon I found myself running downstairs to grab a box of soda for the machine that was upstairs, as well as to turn off the lights. The owner of the building was adamant about never being left on because the wiring was so faulty. He said it was like begging for a structure fire. I could see the light switch at the bottom of the stairs. I could even see the stack of soda boxes. I didn't see anything prowling, and I couldn't hear any more footsteps. So I threw my caution to the wind and went down those goddamn stairs. When I reached the bottom, I saw the last thing that I wanted to see. The door to the biggest walk-in was wide open, and it's halfway down the basement in the middle between the first walk-in and the freezer on the end. Whatever, the lights are on. I'm already down here, so I walked over, grabbed the handle, and before I could yank it shut, something moved to my left, so I instinctually turned to look at it. At first, there was nothing there, just the kegs and random bags of cleaning towels stuffed in between them. Then, I see a shadow pass against the wall, cast from the bowl behind the door that I'm holding. I don't have time to react or anything, or run like I want to. What I would describe as a big menacing shadow person quickly stepped around the edge of the door and into view. Instead of running backwards, I just fell sideways into the walk-in. It was the quickest way to create space in my head, so I just fell in that direction completely out of panic. We have those plastic blinds that try to keep the cold air inside the unit, and they flap closed after I fell through them. I scrambled backwards as the door slammed shut. I stood there for the next 5 or maybe even 10 minutes. Honestly, I don't know how long it was. I just listened to complete destruction behind that steel door. I could hear kegs banging around, slamming into the walls, cans rolling around, boxes tearing. It sounded like a war zone. The door periodically shook with some of the louder bangs. I began to tremor too, as I didn't have a coat and holding temperature down, there was 36 degrees. After a while it got quiet and I couldn't stand to be there any longer. I moved to the door, pressed my ear against it, and just listened. Nothing. I gently pushed the handle in, but the door didn't budge. Something was holding it closed from the outside. I got scared at first, assuming it was the shadow thing that I saw. But as I stood there, shivering for another 10 minutes, I remember all the kegs banging around. Surely, if enough of them were lying on the floor, they could be pinning the door closed. Suddenly, the reality that I might freeze to death settles on my shoulders, like the first faint layer of the frost. The frost that'll kill me. Panic gets a stranglehold on me. I start throwing myself against the door, but again, it doesn't budge a hair. That doesn't deter me though. I push and push and push, until I realize that I'm screaming louder than I ever have before, veins bulging out of my face and neck. I swear I could feel my teeth moving because I was screaming that hard. Only after I gave up and tried to catch my breath did the thing finally start to crack open. Sure enough, as I pushed, I could feel things moving on the other side of the door, shifting around. When there was enough space, I poked my head out to find a couple of kegs and cans holding the door closed. The whole basement was a complete disaster. Like a tornado ripped through there. I climbed out of the walk-in and slammed it closed and booked it over to the stairwell. There's no way in hell that I was going to stay and clean any of that up. I'll just explain in the morning what had happened. I figured that they'd understand. Everyone has had weird experiences that worked there before, but maybe not quite on this level. Only my mom has ever told me stories that are this scary. I cast one more glance behind me as I turned the lights off and went up the stairs. I swear to God, I saw that shadow thing step out from the furthest back corner, as if it manifested itself right before my eyes. Then it was dark, and I was sprinting up to freedom. I grabbed my purse and all my stuff and hightailed it through the main room and down the staircase. When I got there the next morning, everything had already been cleaned up. Everyone was desperate to know what the hell happened. I explained my story, and everyone just nodded, as if they expected it. With the level of destruction that I left behind, they figured it had to be something drastic. Either a robbery or a ghost. Thankfully, nothing like that ever happened to me again, but I also never let myself be alone there anymore. A year before COVID hit, I got hired at a call center way downtown, like inner city. We worked taking calls for a roadside assistance company that will remain anonymous. Although honestly, the last time I looked them up, I couldn't even find a website for them. They may or may not even be in business anymore. Anyway, because of the nature of our industry, our office operated 24 hours a day. It wasn't this big private call center, but just a ground-level corner unit in a commercial office block. We shared a building with 10 or 12 other businesses. All of them would operate during normal hours. At 5 p.m., the whole parking lot cleared out, and the only light on was it had no signage and a keypad on the door for around-the-clock access. We would trade shifts at 4 p.m., midnight, and 9 a.m., usually in two-man teams, sometimes 3 or 4 throughout the week, or on holiday weekends. The overnight shift was typically just one guy, Benji, but holiday weekends, they'd put 2 of us from midnight to 9 a.m. So there we were, I think it was Labor Day weekend, and it's Benji and I handling the phones on a Friday overnight shift. I didn't ever mind getting these shifts because honestly, I love working with the guy. He was a little older than me and has some of the craziest stories that I've ever heard. He grew up inner city, kind of a criminal, but got cleaned up and was looking to break into the music business. I was into drawing and illustration, and he liked looking at whatever I was working on at the time. We'd just hang out and bullshit until the sun came up. We'd even troll people on the phone if they were spamming or dodging the line. Looking back now, it was a lot of fun in those dark hours and a lot of daydreaming. One night we ordered Domino's, split a pizza and some Cinesticks. Legendary meal for a couple of call-room guys. Little did I know in my early 20s that I was slowly becoming lactose intolerant. So all of that cheese and butter would send my stomach and my colon into hysterics. We ate around midnight, talked, and then worked until about 1:30 a.m. Then I started catching the gurgles. By 2 a.m., I knew something was about to happen out of one end or the other. I clued Benji into what was going on so he could watch the phone line for me. I slipped out the door, which was the only way in and out of the office. There was no secondary escape, no back door, just a big panel window in the back. In hindsight, the office almost seemed illegal. Lots of things within the operation were just shady as hell. As you can imagine, because there's so many office units, we also share a single pair of bathrooms. They were on the ground floor, and they were external. As in, the doors were open to the public. Everyone who worked there had a key to either open one door or the other. They were all the way down one of these stretch of businesses, about 40 feet, and then around a corner and tucked into a little back nook of a second floor. This kept them out of sight, so no randoms or weirdos tried to use them and or vandalize them. I go in, struggling with my unbeknownst to me digestive issues, and then wash up. As I'm looking into the mirror, I hear someone push on the door from the outside. I laugh and yell something out, as I assumed it was Benji just messing with me. There was no response except for a couple of hard whacks against the metal. Weird, but I had been in there forever, so again, I think Benji is just being funny. I open the door. There's no one there. I step out and wander down the little hallway, but instead of continuing on to the office, I hook left and go out to a small secondary parking lot. It's out in the back. It's where the dumpsters are, as well as this little outdoor area. As I step into the parking lot, I hear feet slapping the asphalt, running at me from some direction. Now I know something weird is going on. I turn and bolt back for the office. I'm sprinting and about to fall face first into the cement, but catch myself on the handle just in time. I start to punch in the code and immediately get it wrong. It's flashing red. I have to wait 5 seconds for it to reset. All I can hear is my heart, my breathing, and these flapping feet out there in the dark. I jiggle the handle and scream for Benji. I'm banging on the door. Suddenly, I realize I've switched positions. Now it's me outside being the scary, chaotic thing, and I can see him through the blinds, looking over his shoulder. He's on the phone, which is flashing red on 3 ports. It apparently picked up while I was handling my business. I turn and start banging on the glass, begging him to get up. I see him hit the hold button, swing the chair around, and rush over to the door. He pushes it open. I spill in, and he slams it right shut again, breathless. I tell him what had just happened to me. I'm expecting Benji to freak out, lock the extra bolt on the door, and tell me to call the police. Nope, the exact opposite happened. He rolls up his sleeves and steps out into the cool night air. The person was lurking around at the end of the building where it turned for the bathroom nook. They were barefoot, drug-addled, your average homeless fella in our city. I watched from the threshold of the office door as Benji pigeon-chested this guy and gave him the stern get the hell out of here stick, and sure enough got the guy to tuck tail and run. When my wife and I first got married, we would take seasonal trips down to Florida once or twice a year, mostly for the great weather and also to get a little surfing in. We were both born and raised in California, grew up surfing, but didn't actually meet and get romantically involved until we were both living in the Midwest for work. The closest beach for our kind of recreation was just a hop and a skip away. We didn't have friends or family in Florida, so these trips were literally just for us, to satisfy our beach cravings, and even the urge to be out in the sun. Because we didn't have family to visit, we just randomly selected a different coastal town each trip and stay somewhere brand new every time we went down. Being young newlyweds, we weren't making a ton of income. Our savings were all but non-existent. We had to be cheap on these road trips, which meant no hotels, period. Not on the journey, and not after arriving in whatever town we picked previously. We drove a Subaru that had a decent amount of room in it, and we'd save several $100s by just sleeping in it. This was my wife's method of curving our budget, and being an outdoorsman my entire life, I was on board from the moment. She mentioned camping. My wife, Kat, didn't have traditional camping in mind, though this was the early 2000s. So stealth camping wasn't quite as mainstream as it is now. Kat had heard about stealth camping from a co-worker who was a cross-country bicyclist. Her co-worker explained that while on these incredibly long pedaling trips, sometimes the only place to get safety and to get some rest is in a parking lot or the green belt between two businesses. Bikers would pack meager supplies, just enough to keep them going, and then supplement those supplies with whatever they could buy on the road. These bikers would carry light sleeping gear, maybe a tent or just a tarp, and rudimentary stuff like sun blinds or can openers to add a touch of convenience. So we'd start making this part of our Florida trips. We'd load up our Subaru with all kinds of odds and ends. Things that I imagine Boy Scouts would pack. Toothpicks, lighters, a rope, sandwich bags, and batteries. All the little things that you don't really think about until you need them. Everything would be filed away in a neat little stack, along with our bedding to make for a perfect traveling sleep capsule. Kat even had dangling drapes that encircled the back area for privacy. For the better part of 4 years, we had zero issues with our urban stealth camping. The only problem that we encountered was that many of these coastal towns that we were visiting had pretty good curfews and ordinances, so we couldn't overnight in beach parking lots or in front of stores or businesses of any kind. So we had to find places where people parked on the street, and again, for these small coastal towns in Florida, this wasn't a common occurrence. Everyone had a garage or a driveway, so our little Subaru camper stuck out like a sore thumb and never failed though. We would always find some little neighborhood or development where people did use the street. We blend in for a few days, maybe even a week, then hit the road for home. There were showers and facilities at the beach, all kinds of outdoor amenities. But the simple act of just finding a place to shack up for the night that always proved to be the most difficult. Camping in plain sight actually takes a little bit more creativity than folks give us credit for. During one particular trip, we were having an impossible time trying to find a place to set up. It was our first night in town, and by this point in the evening, we've been driving in circles through the community for 3 hours with absolutely no luck on an inconspicuous place to park. Finally though, after following some windy roads that took us through a more rural neighborhood, we found a little stretch between the beach and some houses where people did park on the road. We pulled in on one end, where the neighborhood stopped and the road snaked off into the dark, and called it home. We started on our usual bedtime routines, like brushing our teeth, washing our faces out of the water, getting comfy, locking the doors, and snuggling in for bed. There was a commotion outside though, as we heard walking around and a little talking. Soon someone was climbing into the car that was parked nearest to us, maybe 250 feet behind us, far away enough that we weren't really concerned. They fire up the car and roll off down the lane, only to leave us behind, pretty much alone out there on the street. There was now only one other car parked on the roadway, and it was hundreds of feet behind us. I was worried that they'd be leaving any minute now. Getting a ticket wasn't really in our budget. Kat and I discussed our options, but we were kinda trapped. After driving all day, only to drive even more around town, we didn't have it in us to start the car and look for a more populated area. As we were talking though, our prayers were answered. On the front windshield, we could see a pair of headlights cut up the road the opposite direction and stop somewhere ahead of us. I climbed up and pulled the curtains back, only to find a big dusty van parked about 75 feet off. The second I saw it though, I got this weird feeling from the bottom of my feet to the top of my throat. Something was off, and I let my wife know immediately. She popped up herself, took one look at it, and then got back under the covers. It was creepy, but we were in the middle of a neighborhood, and that was the whole point. We were safe and needed to be incognito, not be suspicious and draw attention to any passing vehicle. She was right, and frankly, I admired her for her undaunted courage, but I didn't like the van, nor how close it was to us. From my place behind the curtain, I watched someone fire up a cigarette in the driver's seat of the van and proceed to smoke it while looking right at our car. I couldn't do it. I told Kat that I was going to sit watch for a bit because everything was just a little creepy. She said whatever, rolled over, and then promptly passed out. I slithered up into the front seat and got comfy behind the wheel. We were parked against the moon and had a decent tent. I was wearing dark clothing, kind of a perfect storm for not being seen behind the windshield. The whole time I just watched this hand go back and forth with the cherry of the cigarette. No smoke escaped the window, not even a whisper. Anyone smoking with the windows up is a total psycho, if you ask me. That being said, my paranoia was now at an all-time high, and to this day, I've never been so suspicious of a person. But I couldn't let it rest. After 30 or 40 minutes of just staring that van down, I finally decided that I was going to go for the long haul. I'd see the sunrise if I had to. Whatever it took to make sure this guy went away. I got the jet boil, the percolator, everything I would need to make a quick, quiet pot of coffee. I set the whole thing up outside the car, on the ground, on the passenger side, so I could stay somewhat hidden from anyone driving by or looking out from their window. I also wanted to force the action. I got tired of watching that van and waiting for something to happen. So I got out and essentially offered a challenge to anyone that wanted to mess with us. Here I am out in the open, no tricks to be pulled. I watched the night sky, listened to the heat whirring beside me, and then I heard the click and slam of a car door opening and closing. I look over, and there's that guy from the van, awkwardly staring at me across that 75-foot gap. And then almost immediately, he starts walking right toward me, one hand in his pocket. He didn't seem panicked or intimidating or anything, just the energy of a man running an errand. I, on the other hand, was low-key tripping out just underneath my skin. This was what I wanted to happen with my open challenge to the world, right? But now, he was coming over. I realized that I bit off a little more than I can chew, and now I was about to choke. I took a deep breath just before he got within earshot, reminded myself that everything was fine. I had a 14-inch Bowie knife laying in the dirt beside me, something my wife and I traveled with everywhere we went. I was going to use it, hopefully to scare this guy off at the first sign of trouble, and if not, very soon. In his chest before he could kill me or my wife. He gets within 25 feet and just stands there, more of that awkward energy. The more the guy does, the more strange that he seems. His hands go in and out of his pockets. He pushes his hair back a few times and then finally comes over, within talking distance. He says hello and asks me, "How's it going?" We share some very brief small talk before you ask me for some matches. The only matches that we had are in the car, but I do have a lighter for the jet boil. So I hand it over and explain that he can just keep it. He seems blown away by this, like he's never received a kinder act of generosity. Continues to thank me over and over again. After a string of thank yous comes to a final end, it goes back to just awkwardly standing there, That's when it occurs to me how big this dude is. 6'2" at the very least. He's broad too, a well-built fella. But it was so dark that his dimensions were hard to discern at first. Now that I sized him up, I was a little uncomfortable again. His awkwardness came off as apprehension, like maybe he was about to jump me or something. You better believe that I had that knife tucked in my waistband just underneath my shirt. It was still in the sheath, so honestly, it would have been a pain to get out and use, but having it close was relieving. I poured 2 cups of coffee in the disposable throwaway cups that me and my wife used. I offered up one to the guy. I told him that I was staying awake for a bit, for a photography shot, as I was an amateur photographer. This part was actually true, but there wasn't any shot that I was looking for. This was just an up and down lie, short of the being an amateur photographer part. That's about the time that this guy decided to dive into his backstory. The stranger told me his name, something I still don't remember, and that he'd very recently been released from prison. He was moving along the coastline on his way to Miami, where he had a job lined up. I nodded along, more interested than you could believe. I could have easily earned an Academy Award with the performance that I put on. Like I was this guy's old high school coach, and he was catching me up on his life or something. Honestly, I wasn't paying attention to what he was saying at all. I was all caught up in a panic, letting one hand rest near the knife in my waistband while looking for signs of aggression in his body language. None ever came, but I was still on high alert. I told the guy that I wished him luck and was going to be turning in soon myself. He said thanks again, then milled around the area for a little bit longer before climbing back into his own van. I saw him light another cigarette and just went back to lounging in the van. For whatever reason, he continued to stare at us. Red flags and alarms had been going off in my head all night, but here I was, somewhere around 2 in the morning, and I hadn't slept any yet. My interaction with that guy was very creepy, but nothing so scary that I needed to run in the other direction. I convinced myself that he was a guy just down on his luck, while I put my coffee supplies away, then slipped into the front seat and watched the area for a few minutes before deciding to turn in. But just as I turned to climb back into the bed space with Kat, something caught my eye. I saw movement along the vegetation between the road and the beach, a shadow at first, but soon I could make out the undeniable figure of a man, one even larger than the guy that I was just talking to. He skulked along the underbrush until he was level with the van, then crossed in front of it and climbed into the passenger's seat. He was very careful with the handle, as I couldn't hear it open nor latch when he silently pulled it closed. The guy was going the extra mile to make sure that no one knew that he was out there. Great. Not one, but 2 ex-convicts roaming around not 100 feet from where my wife and I are trying to sleep. I slammed the key into the ignition and flooded the area with my high beams. Right there in front of me, I could see both guys sitting in front seats of the van, and they gave me a creepy, rotten grin through the glass. The driver held up the lighter and waved it back and forth at me. My wife asked me what the hell was going on, but I just shifted the car in a drive and whipped around to get deeper into town. The logical thing would have been to blow right past them, so I hadn't been down the stretch of road, and that was literally where they'd come from. But we were definitely more familiar. If I was going to have an advantage, it would be to go where town thickened up and more people could intervene. I'll never forget looking up through my rear view and through the flailing fabrics of the blind, seeing that van peel off the shoulder and come rolling after us. They didn't turn their headlights on, but simply followed along in the dark. I could only see the grille and the headlights by the glow of my red backlights. It was a very haunting visual. I did my best to quickly explain to Kat what the hell was going on, all while she's sliding from wall to wall in the back of the car. I told her that the guy in the van was released from prison this week, and had a friend that he didn't mention sneaking around in the dark around our car. As he didn't mention him, I assume his intentions were probably not good. He was likely casing our situation, seeing if we had anything of value. That kind of thing. It only took Kat one peek out of the back window, where she saw the glowing silver grille of that van coming up right behind us, for her to agree that I made the right call. It was time to get the hell out of there, and we had to do it now. Fortunately for us, the neighborhood led right into a well-lit community. Suddenly, that dusty piece of shit van wasn't so scary behind us. They actually looked like assholes, racing and squealing around. They backed off after barely a quarter of a mile and looped back into the darkness near the beach. I drove us to the nearest pharmacy, parked under a light pole, and did my best to fall asleep. The worst-case scenario would be waking up to a ticket, but at that point, I was just lucky to not have been robbed. We lucked out yet again, as Kat and I just snoozed away the morning and woke up without incident. We caught the best lunch that we've ever had, and the cold cuts were unbelievable. We didn't see that van again, and frankly, kind of lost interest in stealth camping. It's been hotels and Airbnbs for us ever since. Personally, I've only ever gone stealth camping one time, and it was during a 2-day drive between where I was going to college and my hometown. The drive itself was about 20 hours. And the town that was smack dab in the middle of that drive was Moab, Utah. I had never been to Moab, but I guess maybe driven through it once. But I'd heard about it just like we all have. That it's paradise for rock climbers, rock crawlers, off-roaders, and outdoorsmen in general. I grew up hiking and camping, so I was kind of excited to see what the town would have to offer for a passerby. As I was planning this trip, I was trying to keep it as cheap as possible. As I mentioned earlier, I was in college at the time, and this was my first trip home for the holidays. I was kind of feeling everything out in terms of what this trip would cost, so I could properly budget out for the future. My first budget cut would be a hotel room. I was driving my old Jeep Cherokee, and Moab was such an outdoor-friendly community. I figured there would be a plethora of campgrounds in that area. I'd just roll into one for one quick overnight for 5 or 6 hours. The day finally came. I packed up my Jeep and hit the road. Everything went exactly to my plan, cutting through the miles until finally, right down at sunset, I got within 10 or 20 miles of Moab. It was so plain out there. No trees or forest from what I could see in the fading sunlight. I didn't worry though. I figured I'd be sleeping in my car anyway. I didn't need trees or forest to do that. By the time I got into Moab though, it was completely dark. I didn't have any idea where to go in terms of camping. This was well before smartphones. So all I had were the Google Map printouts, which I used to piece together a rough idea. Soon I had a campground pegged one just outside of town along the beautiful stretch of the Colorado River. To my memory, it was called Goose Nest Campground, something like 2 miles east of the town limits. Yes, I had Googled if there were campgrounds, but what I failed to learn was that these were paid for, highly sought-after campgrounds. I couldn't just roll into one and use it. The second I did this, I had multiple campers from other units walking me down with flashlights, asking to see a permit or some kind of paperwork, anything saying that I paid to be there. It was probably to keep out the riffraff, and after this happening to me 2 or 3 times, I was too spooked to stick around. I didn't feel friendly, and I thought I was ruining a peaceful night for all these campers, not expecting a stranger to come driving through their area. After getting ran out of those campgrounds, I cruised back into Moab, decided I would just sleep in the parking lot, something like a Walmart or a Denny's, where there's a 24-hour bathroom. I didn't really need comfortable living, I just needed basic stuff to get me to morning. I was really banking on sleeping in the middle of nowhere, but my experience thus far had me hesitant to even go off-roading. Who knows what kind of shit I'd come up on out there. There was no luck for me in town either. The place was crawling with crackheads and weirdos. Every parking lot that I investigated had at least one unsavory-looking guy, if not 5 or 6 of them, shuffling around, up to no good. This was not what I had in mind for such a well-known destination. Absolutely defeated, I decided that I would sleep in the middle of nowhere. I got my Jeep back on the highway and rolled maybe 3 miles south of town and hooked onto the first dirt road that I saw. There was a little cattle guard laid in between some barbed wire fencing, but aside from that, the place was wide open. There were some bluffs that I couldn't see over, so I just decided to park along the little ridge that partially blocked my car, still very cautious of my surroundings. I decided to drape one of my blankets that I had across the windshield and the front windows to keep unwanted eyes outside of my cab. Then I insulated myself up front with my legs across the console and button, the driver's seat, my back against the door, and placed my feet in the passenger seat. It definitely wasn't the most comfy thing ever, but I had a lot of stuff packed in the back. Plus, I wanted to be ready if anything got weird. I got to my spot just in time around 9 p.m., way later than I originally planned. My new plan was to catch some quick sleep and be up by 4, get myself ready and back in town, gas up, and then be back on the highway at sunrise around 5 a.m. It was bare minimum, but again, that was all I needed to get through. Literally bare minimum. Basic survival stuff. Something rumbled me awake in the early hours, just before the time that I wanted to be awake. I cracked an eye open, and outside the Jeep was a big dirt hauler, some kind of tractor truck. It was idling, and just around the blanket curtain that I put up, I could see a guy looking down at me from the cab. Not a minute later, he rumbled off into the desert around one of the bluffs and then disappeared. I didn't put much more thought into it and just tried to go back to sleep. I figured it was some kind of laborer of some kind, and this was his pickup route. A truck that size wasn't up to anything spooky. Not but 30 minutes later, I hear banging on the passenger side window. I crack an eye open and checked my watch, just shy of when my alarm was going to go off. I assumed that I was about to get shooed off by the police or maybe the Forest Service, as the timing would line up with the truck that just drove off by earlier. I yanked the blanket down to find an old beater Chevy outside with a guy staring holes through the glass at me. I started to wave, but before I could, someone bangs on the window directly behind my head. They banged on it so hard that it rattled my teeth, and I slowly began to realize I'm completely surrounded. I turn, and sure enough, there's another guy that looks a lot like the first. Plain t-shirt, Levi's boots. They both start hollering for me to get out of the car. For whatever reason, I obliged. I wanted understanding, just to let these guys know that I was just passing through. I meant no harm. This turned out to be a huge mistake on my part. The second that I unlocked the vehicle, the guys yanked both doors open, pulled me out of the car by my arms and my shoulders. Once they had me on the ground, one sat on me while the other went through everything that I had, starting with my glove box. Saying it was a thorough investigation would be an understatement. I watched while this guy turned my front seats upside down, dumped my glove box and console in the dirt, pocketed anything that I had of value. Coins, electronics, you name it. I swear I even saw him take my push-in lighter just because it was shiny. I explained to the guy that was holding me down, I'm a college student. I'm from out of town. I didn't mean any trouble. I was just lost and trying to get some sleep before hitting the road again. The guy literally mocked everything that I said, repeated it back to me in a stupid voice, even slapped me a few times, all while laughing. He didn't care who I was or where I was from. After a few more minutes, the sun crested the hills. Everything was lit up. I don't know how, but I could tell that that made these guys nervous. I could hear cars on the highway, which I thought were closer during the night, and now that I could see it, it was a good quarter mile away from the main stretch of road. How these guys had found me, I couldn't really be sure. I thought I'd done a pretty damn good job of hiding out. Eventually, after 10 or 15 minutes of being pinned to the ground, they just took off. They instructed me not to follow them, not to call the police, or do anything stupid, because if I did, they'd come back and kill me. They were very, very clear about this when they said it to me. Either way, I'd already made up my mind. They didn't really take much from me, mostly just some food and what little cash I had in front with me. After making sure I was okay and intact, I got back in my Jeep, went back towards Moab. It took me a bit, but after making a couple of laps, I found the police department, went in and made a report. At first, they were pretty dismissive, as I was a college-age student, an out-of-state license, and dirty as hell. I probably looked like a crazy vagrant. Only after I explained where this happened did the officers seem to take one of the deputies asked me. I did my best to explain exactly where I pulled off on the road. The deputy turned back to his superiors, and they talked for a moment, going over some notes of prior reports. It turned out that the guys that had robbed me had been making trouble around town for a couple of weeks, and most, if not all, the reports were coming from the south side of town. Furthermore, the dirt road that I pulled off on to get some sleep, well, that road led to a pretty big ranching outfit, and I don't mean a dude ranch resort, but a real agricultural facility. They even had a mine out there on the property, hence the Big Mac truck that rolled by me in the early morning hours. Well, a couple of guys had been sneaking in and out of the ranch, usually in the middle of the night. They would come in empty-handed, stumble around the property until they turned on some an alarm. Then they would go scurrying back out into the desert with whatever they could grab. Tools, copper, raw ore, building materials, literally anything they could sell into turning a couple of bucks. My misfortune turned into a stroke of luck for the local police department. I took them out to where my incident took place, and from there, the sheriff's department was able to track these assholes down by the end of the day. They found them holed up in a little cave in a wash that intersected with a river. They had water storage, all kinds of stuff to give them actually a livable, decent life. The issue is, they all pillaged locals and travelers like me to get it all. Not after that day, I got all my stuff back, which, as I said, wasn't really that much. Maybe 50 total, along with some of my personal stuff like blankets. I have no idea what happened to all those men, but I'm sure the camp was cleaned up. Missing items returned to owners, and everything else dumped in the trash. From there, I'm sure those dudes got locked up, and I went about my business. Like I said in the beginning, this was my first and only time stealth camping, and I can confidently tell you I'll never, ever do it again. A few years ago, my wife and I were going to go visit her sister somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. We're an older couple, but not ancient, not even retired, so we make up all trips like this pretty often. Recently though, or at least within the last 5 years or so, we've been hearing about a new fad called stealth camping. My wife and I thought this was funny, as we've done this kind of thing for years across many different states and many different cities. I'll admit we were fascinated though. We found all kinds of YouTubers and TikTok streamers, people coming up with new ways to camp in more and more populated areas. Some of the stuff that we were seeing was genius, cutting-edge kind of thinking, and some of the other content. So I'm going to go ahead, and I'm going to go ahead, and I'm going to go ahead, and I only started simple at first, just sleeping in the car in well-lit parking lots, then slowly transitioned into more isolated methods of camping. Instead of sleeping in a Walmart parking lot, we'd find a luxury condo, or maybe even a gated community, somewhere with a little more security. We'd follow someone inside, find a nice, non-reserved parking place, and sleep away the night without anyone knowing. Dawn would come, and we'd get ourselves ready, roll right out the exit gate as if we'd lived there our whole lives. It was a lot of fun, and always made for some mild excitement. Now, stealth camping isn't quite the same as boondocking, which was something else that my wife and I had done. Boondocking is just breaking camp in the middle of nowhere, generally public land, and that doesn't have services or any amenities. It's essentially just typical camping. We like to stealth camp because it kept you in town limits, and you didn't actually have to get to anything set up. You got to utilize your car in a way that you normally don't get to. Well, after a year of exploring and experimenting in the great fad of stealth camping, we decided to try something new. We visited my sister-in-law. Instead of just using a car, we were going to actually find a place within town and city limits to set up a little camp and sleep outdoors. We'd seen enough videos and practiced enough on our own to feel confident we could get away with it. Looking back, I don't know what the hell we were thinking. This was some ultimate bored, middle-aged white people activities, if such a thing ever existed. Everything on this trip was going good at first. We stopped 3 or 4 nights at this point, all of which were successful outdoor ventures. Now we were actually in the city and needed to be careful with the place that we chose. After getting some food and stretching out our legs, we started shopping around for a place to set up. It wasn't long before we spotted this quaint little greenbelt behind a Target store. It had ominous fencing that didn't actually have a warning of any kind. There was grass and a line of trees, even a little hill to offer a vantage point. By and large, it seemed absolutely perfect. It would make for the most high-profile stealth camping adventure for us yet. Now, you can't just go in and start setting up full camp with people around. We'd have to make several trips to and from our car. What's going on, pal? Oh, hey, come here. What is it? You don't need to do this, man. We were left to do our business. We didn't have a ton of supplies or anything, but we'd like to be comfortable and didn't want to have to return to our car for any reason. As I've been saying, we took it pretty seriously, compared every step of our camping to some videos that we'd seen. We knew all of this had to be safe and secret, so we held ourselves to a certain standard. At the end of the day, though, it was a lot of fun and something to tell our friends about. The camp itself was tucked into a thicket of trees. He's about halfway up that hill, which kept our tent out of view from pretty much every direction. It was a dark nylon, 2-person tent, and so small that it blended in perfectly with the surroundings. Up where the trees were a little flat area to put the tent, which also had a 2-person cot inside. It was very comfortable and kept us off the ground, which did preserve our backs a bit. Again, we're older. You can't blame us for preventing the aches and pains if able to. We settled into a couple of collapsible chairs that we brought along. We spared no luxury with the isolation that we had back there. We talked in hushed voices, shared a snack, and had a little wine, and just watched the sky. It was relaxing, very mellow. You almost couldn't tell that we were in the heart of a major metropolitan area. Somewhere behind us, we could faintly hear the drone of the highway, but then we heard something much closer. Tires squealing through the parking lot. The hill wasn't so high that we couldn't see over the Target building, but it was obvious that some kid just whipped in the lot, was doing donuts or something to that effect. Every time that we thought it would stop, they would just cut the wheel and gun it the other direction. It was very off-putting, but not quite enough to be scared or anything. Our car was parked out there, but there were a few other cars too. Random lot overnighters, maybe even graveyard shift workers. There was a stretch in numbers that hopefully whoever this was would be careful enough not to crash into any of the cars. It quieted down after a while, and soon my wife and I were getting ready for bed. There's something about sitting in the dark, especially outdoors, that just drains my battery. It could be 7 p.m., and I'd tell you it was midnight. I just lose all sense of time and want to be asleep the whole time I'm out there. Just as soon as we're getting ready to break down the chairs and go inside our tent, we hear that same car come ripping through the parking lot once again. Except this time, it comes to a screeching halt. My wife and I look at each other. That's new. Then we hear a car door open and shut. A second one. Then we hear footsteps. Voices. everything is getting louder. My wife and I look at each other in total terror as two strangers pull the fence back and start wandering right into the green belt that we're hiding in. We can hear them clearly now. They aren't talking about anything nice or friendly, mostly violence and drug use. I couldn't believe this was actually happening. My wife starts to get up, but I stopped her, whispered for her to stay put. The trees had us totally blocked from view. The only way we'd be found was through sound. The less movement, the less likely that we'd be caught. She sat back, put a hand over her mouth, and just waited. Thankfully, those voices slowed down as the two strangers stopped short of where we were lingering, down in that flat area before the hill. There was a big fallen tree down there too, bigger around than a car tire and made for a good bench. I considered camping next to it earlier, but found it too close to the fence for comfort, and thank God that we didn't do that, or we would have been discovered almost immediately. Now we just listened to these guys talk for a while. Obviously, we didn't know their names, so I'll just refer to them as Guy 1 and the loud guy. Guy 1 was only a little softer spoken, but talked at such a fast speed that we had a hard time keeping up with him. I'll try to recreate as much of the conversation as I can remember. At first, they were just talking about doing drugs and getting high partying. But eventually, the talks turned into violence. Violent stuff. They'd done stuff they wanted to do, and this eventually led them to why they were out there in the first place. Damn, dude. What time is it? Is he even coming or what? The loud guy asked. Yeah, he said he'd be late. He's always late. Can't wait to do this, guy once said. Yeah, me too, man. Dude's a scumbag. Loud guy. Agreed. Now they start trailing off about how they were supposed to meet a third person, a drug dealer of some kind. They were going to rip him off right back here. Apparently, they'd bought from this guy pretty regularly, but his prices went up, and his consistency had gone down. Addiction turned to desperation, and both of those turned into anger for Loud Guy and Guy 1. Anger that they planned on using to utilize to rob the person that was causing their problems, or at least so they reasoned. We definitely didn't like what we were hearing, but our options were limited. We were outgunned against these goons, and we had no interest in running them off or tangling up in any way. I had a gun, naturally, but that was an absolute last resort. It was an unspoken agreement that we could just hide, stay quiet, and wait out whatever the hell was about to happen. The second it was clear, we'd call the police and get the hell out. The two goons kept talking about all kinds of creepy, colorful stuff. My wife ended up covering her ears because it was so gross, beyond locker room talk, but the truly heinous daydreams were over. Of the criminally deprived minds. After a while, we heard footsteps approaching from the outside. I prayed for a security guard or someone, but it turned out to be the long-awaited drug dealer. Showtime. They all started exchanging pleasantries, shaking hands. This part actually felt almost cool as my wife and I were the only ones privy to what was really going on, or at least, so we thought the conversations then turned to business. Loud. Guy starts to inquire about their perk, and drug dealer pulls a gun out of his jacket and points it right in Loud Guy's face. What the hell, man? He screams. You didn't say you'd have a gun. There's a lot I didn't tell you. Guy 1 says, now empty out your pockets. This whole exchange was a double setup as Guy 1 was never gonna rob the drug dealer, what was actually in cahoots with him. Then the second gun came out, a shouldered up and Loud Guy immediately realized that he was done for his own. The option was to get louder and louder, which for him came pretty easy. They didn't let it happen though. My wife almost gave us up when the drug dealer pistol whipped that Loud Guy not once, but twice. It got really quiet. Guy 1 rolled him over, started working him over, checking his pockets, then literally hog-tying him. Loud Guy started to grumble again. I would thought they were friends. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Guy 1 took a filthy rag from the culvert ditch and stuffed it inside his mouth. Talk about cold-hearted. After that, drug dealer and Guy 1 went through the contents of Loud Guy's pockets. They even took his shoes and his socks off, where I guess the real haul was found. From what we could hear, they came upon $900 in cash, half an ounce of cocaine, and also had piano wire in his pockets, apparently a tool of his. Then, the worst thing that you can imagine happened. My wife's whole body lurched, her eyes went wide, and she let out the loudest sneeze that you can imagine. I froze, totally shocked at what just happened. My first instinct was to say something like, "What the hell?" But I knew that would only add to the fire that we just started. She put a hand over her mouth and nose and did her best not to breathe. She has wicked allergies in the Pacific Northwest. We had forgotten all about it in the moment, and now it was too late. It just got us busted. I watched through the trees as all three heads, even the guy tied up on the ground, slowly turned up to look in our position. The drug dealer even briefly pointed the gun up at us. We didn't move. We didn't give up exactly where we were. We knew the hill was dark and shrouded, especially where our tent was. Much to our surprise, the drug dealer and Guy 1 started to backpedal towards the parking lot. They shouted a few threats, talked some tough guy shtick, and even threw some more shade on Loud Guy, who's still tied up on the ground. My wife and I kept still as they slowly disappeared through the fence and around the side of the building. They hopped inside Guy 1's car, the squealing menace from earlier, as we realized we never actually heard the drug dealers arrive in a vehicle. We surmised that he must have walked from some nearby location to eliminate loose ends. The car tore out of the parking lot, left us alone in that green belt. Alone, except for Loud Guy. He was aggressively rolling back and forth at the bottom of the hill. We could hear him grunting, struggling to get free, but it was no use. After 20 minutes or so, he finally gave up, panting, face down in the dirt. I honestly think he passed out from exhaustion. My wife and I wasted no time, immediately started breaking down camp. The chairs first, then tucked in all our loose equipment into the cooler, like a big stacked up pile. We took the tent apart as quietly as we could, careful not to step on anything that might give us away. Once that was rolled up, we were ready to break for our car. We heard something though. Loud Guy was starting to fight with his buying knees again. Except this time, he was clearly making some progress. It wasn't more than a few seconds later, and suddenly his arms were free, which moved down quickly to get his ankles undone. Soon, he popped up muttering to himself, brushing the dirt off his clothes. My wife and I were frozen. We had no idea what the hell to do. We were already scared enough at just the prospect of trying to walk by this dude, but now he was up and free. He took one final look around the greenbelt, then bolted for the parking lot. We stood and listened to his fading footfalls until we couldn't hear them anymore, then stood and listened some more. We weren't in much of a rush to get caught by any of these people. It was just by pure luck that none of them had come up the hillside to see who or what we were. Once we were positive that everyone was gone, we huffed all of our stuff out to the car and dialed 911 and hit the road. My wife made a full, thorough report, all except for the fact that we were camping behind Target. The dispatcher assured my wife that lots of calls came out of this part of town. Apparently, we've been trying to camp in one of the more crime-ridden areas of the city. We'd never heard anything more about the trio of drug-dealing turncoats. And believe it or not, my wife and I continued to stealth camp after that. We just upped our game, like we always do. We do way more research now, as the internet has made it much easier to avoid crazy encounters just like that. That night, we caved and got a hotel, just to avoid any further chaos. If you're going to stealth camp, be careful. Be quiet, be careful, and be prepared for anything. When I was a kid, my dad and his buddy would take me out woodcutting deep in the Montana wilderness. My dad's friend, Uncle Kermit, drove this ancient, dilapidated truck that you could literally see through the floorboards of. The wheel wells were completely rusted out, the exhaust was chewed through and loud as hell. It was an iconic trailer park menace, almost stereotypical for where and when we lived. Dad and Kermit brought me along, not only for my benefit, but under the guise of making me a man. The real reason was they'd have a young, able-bodied, sober hands on site for most of the grunt work. When I was really young, I think 9 years old up until about 13, I'd be the log hauler. Dad and Kermit would slog through the area, bust everything up with their saws and axes, and I'd put it all in piles and then take it back to the truck. This made sure the adults could keep moving, keep buzzing logs, and keep drinking beer, all without lifting a finger to load the truck. By the time I was older, not only was I a resilient log hauler, but I had to drive too. By the time I could see over the wheel, my dad and Uncle Kermit would take full advantage and really get to drinking. This was in the 1980s, in the middle of nowhere, Montana, so as long as the driver wasn't drunk, local deputies didn't really care if I had a license or not. They knew one option was better than the other, so I got more responsibilities out of it. I didn't really mind though, because driving the truck and handling chainsaws felt pretty cool to my teenage self. There was one particular trip where everything seemed to be going wrong. Storm clouds rolled in when there wasn't any forecast for precipitation. Then the truck started acting up, chugging at first in town, and then we realized the transmission itself was completely shot. You could shift through the regular gears, but downshifting was really hard. Shifting into regular reverse was damn near impossible. It just wouldn't slip. So we're stuck in a rambling old truck that could only go forward at only certain speeds. We were begging for trouble, and we'd find plenty of it out there that day. Everything was going per usual. 3 of us were spread out about 10 feet, each equipped with a chainsaw and buzzing everything up in sight. I wasn't as quick as the older guys, so add that to the fact that I had to pile up everything. I fell behind really quickly. We were walking along a hillside that gently sloped up to my right and then down to my left. This was my least favorite kind of terrain, short of straight uphill, I guess, because gravity worked against me. Anything that got away from me just barreled down the side of the hill, gone until I had to retrieve it. My dad and Uncle Kermit disappeared up ahead, through the brush, and then over the hillside. I could still hear their saws, though, roaring through all manner of deadfall. It was easy to keep track of each other, and the chainsaw, saws made for good security. They were so loud that no predator wanted to get within a quarter of a mile of us, and if they did well, we're 3 guys with chainsaws. We weren't really that worried about animals getting the jump on us. I came up on this absolutely massive old oak tree sprawled out through some still standing pine. It was the kind of haul that would take more than one trip with a truck, so I just went to work turning out the outer limbs into nice logs before turning my saw in the trunk. It was a gnarled tree, so I knew it was going to turn my hands into pudding, running that saw through it. Still, I started turning the trunk into rounds. There were a couple of knots up ahead, but I was on autopilot at this point, just trying to finish the minimal wear to my arms. I set the blade between a couple of the knot holes, hit the trigger, and let the sawdust fill the air around me. I could feel some rot in the wood, empty spaces where the blade passed through much quicker. After the saw padded through, I brought my boot up and kicked the round as to separate it from the rest of the tree so I could take a better look. This was the worst mistake of my life, as when I bent down to investigate the rot, a whole swarm of bats came screeching out of the hollow. They were beating against my legs, flapping up the inside of my flannel, even tied up in my hair. It was something right out of a movie, and a horrific one at that. I froze up immediately, and had the bats passed over me quicker, I probably would have been fine. I was surrounded though, as I felt myself begin to suffocate on wings and fur everywhere. I turned, and panic set in. I started to stumble backwards. The hill itself sloped down and away, so as I moved backward, I started to fall. As I did that, my hand tried to find something to grab onto, and the only thing within reach was the handle of my chainsaw. I squeezed the trigger, got the blade chain spinning, and then ran the whole saw through my right calf. It was the worst pain I've ever felt, truly blinding, as I felt the teeth pull through my skin, then the fat, and finally the muscle. Blood erupted as if I tapped a fire hydrant, literally spewing down my leg and spurting through the air like a little sprinkler system. It was spraying out multiple places, so different streams shot in different directions. I imagined my veins and artery chewed to bits, so I figured there would be no way to stop the blood. I collapsed in the underbrush and just laid there for a minute, letting the shock wash over me. Things were bad, but I couldn't tell what the damage was yet. Had I broken something on the fall? It sure felt like it, and my leg was a mess. I checked myself for bites and bats and made sure they were all gone. Next, I checked out my fingers, my arms. My elbow was racked really good, but I couldn't tell if it was broken or not. It was jammed up enough that I couldn't use it to stand back up though. The chainsaw was laying behind me, idling hard, chain just a few inches from my hip. I reached over and hit the kill switch, then used my good leg to kick it a healthy distance from me. Again, I tried to use my bum arm to get up, but it was completely shot. The brush had enveloped me in such a way that it was almost anchoring me to the ground. So between my bum leg and bum arm, I wasn't going anywhere. The only option was to wait for my dad or Kermit to loop back and find me. This took way longer than I was prepared for, but felt like an hour went by. I couldn't even hear their saws anymore. I figured they were drinking and waiting for me to catch up. I started hollering through the trees calling for help that I was injured, no haul or back. It was late morning at this point. Well, I wasn't worried about overnighting or anything like that, but I was aware of how much blood I was losing. More time passed. I couldn't tell you exactly how much midday came and went. I was still alone, losing body temp now and starting to smell my own wound. I was starting to entertain the idea of death when I heard my dad calling out, and I quickly shouted back, "Try," to where I was. I could see them through the trees, maybe a quarter mile away. I kept shouting and started shaking near branches to show them exactly where I was. My dad finally got a beat on me, started busting up the hill. When he saw what happened, his face went sheet white, and he almost collapsed. He started screaming for Kermit to get up there, so they could get me shouldered and carried back to the truck. The old man wasn't as spry as my dad, plus he was completely drunk, so he really had to fight up every step of the hillside. Finally, though, he got to me and realized how bad it was. Between the two of them, they slung all 3 saws and the rest of the gear in my 14-year-old self through that forest and back to where we parked. This is where we had to make some hard decisions. Because of where my wound was, I wasn't able to bend my leg, so getting into the cab was not an option. I was going to have to ride in the back of the truck, and someone would probably have to ride with me to keep me from sliding around too much. When I was younger and more inclined to chase paper at literally all hours of the night, I took a side gig as an Uber driver. This was on top of my full-time job in retail. Working a counter and making sales just didn't have the payout that I needed at the time.
Madison's sister lives far away. At night, when it's quiet, she can hear the ocean. Madison doesn't exactly know these things to be true because no one admits that she has a sister. Still, it's more than just a feeling or a suspicion. It's like when there's an animal in the walls. The way she scratches and swishes and thumps leave you certain of it, even if it's a creature your eyes have never seen. Madison has never had an animal inside the walls of her home. Her sister has, though. She's been aware of her for as long as she can remember, but she's only lately come to understand who she is, her twin, her other half. Until now, she was more like a projector in Madison's head that showed her images of a cold and barren place. face of mist rising off the white shore of a beach made purely of tiny shells. A trickster who would wake her up with a salty, fishy odour of a dock in her nose. It's a smell she had never experienced, but nevertheless recognises. Lately, Madison can almost see her when she closes her eyes, when she's sleeping in her bed, curled on her side. She can smell her sister's hair from wherever she, too, is lying in her home somewhere far away. It's a rotted, outy smell, but it's as comforting to her as warm milk with nutmeg. Today, for the first time, she heard her sister's actual voice. Her words tumbled down, one by one, through her brain like this. Your mom is not our mom, real mommy. Her voice can be hard to understand. Madison must concentrate on it very hard all the way to kindergarten. She can't stop thinking about these words until now. She's thought of her mummy as mommy and her daddy as daddy. She realizes, though, that her sister is right. This isn't her real mommy, only a woman. The woman's husband is only a man. She wants to ask her sister where their real mommy is, if her sister is with her. She doesn't know how to talk back to the voice, though. Madison has always known that she was adopted. You weren't born from my belly, honey, but from the love in our hearts, and that makes you extra special. They have made her understand that she has a whole culture that doesn't belong to them, only to her. And they've bought her books of folk tales that are full of kids with faces like her own. She finds it strange, then, that they haven't told her about her sister. What are you thinking about? Though Maddie B, the woman asks Madison, looks to see her eyes watching her in the rearview mirror. My sister, she says she hasn't mentioned her before. You are. The woman says, her eyes crinkling for only a second before she forces them to look friendly again. Sister? You mean my sister, Aunt Julie? No, she says coldly, mine. She turns her face away and looks out her window. She isn't going to talk anymore if the woman is going to be a liar. At dinner, the man asks, why the long face, hun? He shares a glance with the woman, and Madison knows they've been talking.